Hi, I want to read an essay I did in 1992 in college as a returning student. The Peace Movement of the Vietnam War era. When most of us think of a peace movement, we remember the days of the Vietnam War and the protests in the streets of major cities and on the campuses of colleges and universities across America. The images brought to mind are ones of draft card burnings, sit-ins, and of flower children defiantly placing their flowers into the gun barrels of National Guardsmen. The resurrection of the peace symbol in recent years has sparked a renewed interest in the activities of that movement. The escalation of the Vietnam conflict, it was never declared a war by an act of Congress, was the catalyst for different forms of protest, mainly among many young adults who desired major reforms in the handling of domestic problems and foreign affairs. The indiscriminate use by the U.S. government of its military to force its very unclear policies on a tiny nation like Vietnam, especially at the expense of the lives of our young men, with no choice in the matter, epitomized everything that was wrong with a system gone mad with human rights violations inside and outside the country. The most notable part of the anti-war coalition, the student movement, or as it had become known by the mid-60s, the New Left, was comprised of the Students for a Democratic Society and the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. The sit-in became their chief method of demonstration. The subsequent assaults and brutality by police on these mostly middle-class students involved in the freedom struggle caused a change in the way they saw the lives of the oppressed. No longer blind to the plight of the civil rights activists of today, they now perceive the work of men like Martin Luther King Jr. as only a small part of a bigger problem. It was an enlightening experience which helped them see that the enemy was right here at home. The new awareness on the part of these students resulted in attempts to join hands with other groups on the left, civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, black militants, and radical labor. These efforts, however, were fruitless. For example, the National Conference for New Politics, which met in Chicago in the fall of 1967, was a complete failure. It only exposed the differences in priorities between the factions, and the conference wavered between anarchy and elitism. Any agreements between the civil rights activists and the peaceniks were on an individual basis and were attributed to the desire for love and brotherhood, not the anti-war effort. It can be argued here that if it were not for the civil rights movement, there would have been no anti-war demonstrations at all. The anti-war tools, sit-ins, marches, and demonstrations were copies of the methods used by King. However, the civil rights movement might have benefited from the publicity gained by predominantly white peaceniks, because this helped to condition the American people to accept change through their reassessment of human values. One of the values tested by some was the fundamental belief that a person has the right to choose whether to take up arms against another human being. Conscientious objectors had diverse reasons for not wanting to shoot at someone. Some said it was not self-defense, it was murder. Others declared the war's lack of a true cause as a reason not to join the ranks of the brave who did it for God and country. The guilt carried by the conscious objectors in the ensuing years was very real. Most, however, have come to grips with these feelings. For example, Larry Voller was a conscientious objector during the war, and in his grueling efforts to analyze what transpired in those days, he has realized a similarity between himself and Vietnam veterans. Quote, I have talked to some Vietnam veterans who say they felt guilty when their buddies were blown away and they survived. There for the grace of God, that maxim was our mantra then. Though the specifics were different, our reactions to what we did and what happened to us are almost the same. The pressure felt by the conscientious objectors was typical of the suffering endured by the peace movement at the hands of an American public that, since the American Revolution, had come to believe their government could do no wrong, that it had the blessings of God Almighty, and was totally justified in whatever it did. It was this blind faith that fueled the hatred between the New Left and the Conservatives. The generation gap thus created was felt throughout the country, with our own Bay County area no exception. This was evident in a letter written by a local resident to the editor of the Panama City Herald. Quote, "No person should be allowed to attend college with the appearance of a savage, and any college student who creates disturbances in the college should be expelled and his record furnished to all other colleges. Recently, one of the officials of a Florida college openly and publicly asked the students and teachers to overthrow and take over the state-owned college. I say any teacher or professor in the schools and colleges of this country which are teaching communism or the overthrow of our country and colleges should not only be fired from their job, but tried for treason." Unquote. The reference here to the appearance and behavior of the student protesters gives a clue to one reason why the anti-war movement failed. Their efforts to intentionally shock and offend with their long hair, pot smoking, and total disregard for established institutions might have prevented the working class and rural people from taking a firm stand against the war. Their attempts to bring national attention to their cause in these ways ultimately discredited, in the eyes of many, an otherwise viable argument. Friction within the movement also contributed to the problems. At a national meeting of the Student Mobilization Committee in June 1968, a split occurred. One of the factions wanted to concentrate the efforts of the organization on anti-war demonstrations, while the others desired opposition of the draft and racism. This kind of disagreement about what should be the primary mission of the peace movement was central to the conservatives' view that the anti-war movement as a whole was not to be taken seriously, that it was not an exercise in democracy but a fiasco which served only to embarrass the American public. However disappointing these conflicts of interest were, the movement left its mark. The seeds of peace were sown throughout the world, and humanity has since been forced to look twice at matters concerning individual rights and freedom of expression. Women's rights, gay rights, and some Indian tribes, for instance, have received much needed attention to their causes. These types of organizations draw strong criticism, but they are not openly attacked by the military and police, thanks to the pioneering efforts of the anti-war demonstrators. We still have a long way to go, though, if we are to have a lasting domestic and international peace, and we Americans have the biggest job ahead of us. Perhaps this point is best forwarded by William Sloane Coffin, who was a leader in the anti-Vietnam War movement and the civil rights struggle. Quote, "There are things in us today that we must bury, just as the Soviets are trying to bury Stalinism and the Chinese Maoism. Probably the hardest thing for us is going to be the understanding and feeling that somehow the U.S. is morally superior to every other country in the world. This innocence about our misdeeds, not understanding that we've been accomplices in the very evils we profess to abhor, that's got to be buried." Unquote. The anti-war effort was a failure, but it gave us an assurance that America can withstand criticism from within its own boundaries. This relief from the fear of collapse will prove to be a valuable tool in the worldwide quest for peace. It will become fashionable among world leaders as they listen to the voice of the people to work together to achieve compromise and a meaningful, lasting end to conflict everywhere.